What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mike Dolce Show. Today, we are talking about some statements Daniel Cormier has made regarding Tony Ferguson. Let me jump right into the statements right now for you. This is going to be a quick video. Thank you guys all for being here. Let's hear what DC had to say. Then I'm going to offer a controversial counterpoint.
I think what the most discouraging thing about it is honestly is Tony Ferguson's decline. It's sad because for so long he was so good in a weight division where it was hard to become the champion. So he only held a portion of the belt by becoming the interim champion. But Tony Ferguson at his peak was as good as anybody in the UFC, but his decline now has been very steep. And it hasn't been like gradual. It was very fast how he kind of fell off a cliff. I want to know, I'm kind of interested to see what Tony Ferguson is going to do next. He said he's back when the fight was over, and I don't know what would guide him to believe that he's back in that performance. Sure, he did some things well, but I don't believe for a second that Tony Ferguson should have taken that performance and feel like he's building towards something. I believe Nate Diaz is going to go up and fight Jake Paul.
All right, now let's just stop it right here, and let me give you a counterpoint. So DC basically said that the disappointing part about UFC 279 was, in Daniel Cormier's opinion, it was Tony Ferguson's steep decline. And he said at one point, this guy was at the very top of the division in a very tough division, the lightweight division, and he was able to claim a piece of the title, which was the lightweight interim world title. And let me show you Tony's record as I talk over this for you. So let me give you even a bigger screen here so you can see. Now, let's just scroll through to... Let's scroll through to here so we can see in Tony Ferguson's UFC career, which dates back to right here, 2011. Tony Ferguson beats Ramsey Nijem. He beats Aaron Riley. He beats Yves Edwards. He has a decision loss to Michael Johnson. He comes back. He beats Mike Rio, Katsunori Kakuno, Abel Trulio, Gleason Tebow, who recently beat Rory McDonald, Josh Thompson, Edson Barbosa, Lando Venata, and UFC lightweight world champion Rafael Dos Anjos. He beats number one contender Kevin Lee, who fought for the world title. He beats Anthony Pettis, who held the world title. He beats Donald Cerrone, who fought for the world title. So we can see from 2011 through 2019, heck, Tony Ferguson was fighting at the very top of the division, and he was fighting very successfully, almost all wins except for the one lone loss to Michael Johnson. As he moves forward, he wins the interim world title. He holds it for a minute, and then he runs into Justin Gaethje. Now, let me show you this on the larger screen once again. He runs into Justin Gaethje, who twice fought for the UFC lightweight world title. He fights Charles Oliveira, who goes on to win and hold the UFC world title. He goes on to fight Beneil Dariush, who should be fighting for the UFC lightweight world title. Top three on some people's cards. Dariush is a number one contender. He loses to Michael Chandler, former Bellator world champion and UFC title contender. Chandler lost to Charles Oliveira, and then he fights and loses against Nate Diaz while moving up to 170 pounds. So Daniel Cormier says it is the saddest thing is Tony Ferguson's rapid decline. And I disagree with that. If you only look at the record, you can see that, wow, you see all this green, 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 and then all this red, all this red, all this red. Well, what is the difference here? The difference is not that as much. And listen to me, ladies and gentlemen, I don't believe Tony Ferguson's skills have dropped off the cliff, as Daniel Cormier says. What I believe is that Tony Ferguson has always been a top 3 lightweight. I do not believe that Tony Ferguson was ever able to bridge the gap between top 3 and number 1. And that's the difference here. Tony Ferguson at his best was a perennial top 3 candidate at his best. But he was never able to truly, consistently knock off the number 2, the number 1 guy, or the champion himself. And his record clearly shows that. Gaethje fought for the title twice. Well, Gaethje beat Ferguson. Oliveira holds the title. Oliveira beat Ferguson. Dariush, I believe, is that top 3 and possibly the heir apparent to a future version of the title. Chandler is already has been on the pound for pound list for years, and Nate Diaz is a much larger opponent, 170 pounds. Nate Diaz has been in the 170s at welterweight for a while, fought Conor McGregor at welterweight. Nate Diaz is a late last night replacement for Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson trained for a 3-round fight versus an orthodox striker, and the fight was changed in a day. He's fighting a much taller, much longer southpaw fighter in Nate Diaz. So going 4 rounds with Nate Diaz, well, that's not a bad thing on such short notice anyway. And what Cormier says earlier in the interview is Tony Ferguson did such a good job with those inside leg kicks to Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz was limping terribly. If that fight went on another kick or 3 or 10, another round or 2, if that fight went on another 5 minutes, who knows what Tony Ferguson would have been able to pull off against an equally experienced Nate Diaz. So my point here, what do you guys think? Did Tony Ferguson, did his skills drop off so terribly? Or is Tony Ferguson now simply fighting at the limit of his potential? I love Tony Ferguson. I think Tony Ferguson is great. He's great for the sport. I think he's a great human being. I've spoken with Tony behind the scenes on a few different occasions. I'm a fan of Tony. And this is no disrespect. I think Tony Ferguson is a perennial top 3 guy in the world. But not a top 2, not a number 1 guy, not the champ. He had a piece of the title, the interim title, which means the champ was unavailable. The number 2 guy, their number 1 contender was kind of unavailable. Tony had a piece of that. He fought Dos Anjos and fought Pettis and beat them at times when they were, I believe, not quite at their peak. I'm not discounting Tony at all. Please, this is a credit to Tony. I'm actually, when I heard what Daniel said, I thought what Daniel said was disrespectful. I felt he was disrespecting Tony Ferguson, all his work, all his skill, and his ability. But just because a guy loses against the top 2, top 1, the champion, because a guy cannot break free from being the 3rd best guy in the world, he cannot clear that hurdle. And you think about every sport. If you think about distance running and, long and short distance running, the top 1, 2, 3 guys or gals are almost always. The middle of the pack is almost always, and the end of the pack is almost always. I believe a guy like Tony is always right there, nipping at the heels of the number 2, number 1, and the champ. And he can beat them on any given day if everything goes right. But the champs can beat most everyone on any given day, even when things go wrong. And I think that's the difference. So I don't believe Tony Ferguson has fallen off the cliff, as Daniel says. If you look at his career, if you look at his win-loss ratio on paper, you could say that. But if you look at the quality of opponents Ferguson has been fighting over the last 3 years, he's been fighting the number 1, number 2 guy in the world for, let me briefly look at this again, for the last 2 years, since 2020. Gaethje, Oliveira, Dariush, Chandler, and Nate Diaz. That is not a steep decline of his skills nor ability. That is a steep increase in the quality of opposition he has fought. What do you guys think? Was Daniel being a little too harsh on Tony? Am I being a little too kind on Tony? Or maybe you have a better opinion? Definitely leave it in the comments below. Thank you guys. What do you, there seems to be a lot of excitement and a lot of interest in this MMA-based content. Tell me, what do you think? More MMA-based videos, more fitness and fat loss videos? It is up to you. You guys drive this channel. Thank you all so much for being here. And if you've stayed this long, consider giving this video a thumbs up and even subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. Until next time, boom.